Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gapesty here. Today we're looking at Heroic Kormrok, and as usual this guide will help you with normal as well as Heroic. Heroic's just generally a tuned up version of the normal mechanics. So this boss is fairly easy mechanically, but there can be quite a bit going on at any given time, and your ability to react quickly is vital. So the main goal here is to deal with the boss by himself. There are very few adds, if any, you could argue, while he jumps to the various pools on the outside edge. You have a fiery pool, toxic pool, and shadow pool. As he does this, he'll become empowered for whichever pool he stepped into and improve the main ability he does for that pool. So as we go through the fight, we'll talk about the different pool mechanics. There aren't very many of them, and the normal versus the empowered versions and how you deal with those differently. Generally speaking, I would suggest the normal 2 tanks, about 1 healer per every 5 players in the raid. Healing requirement is not all that high on this fight, outside of a few cooldown moments. As for the order, I think you want to focus on the fiery pool first, shadow pool second, and green pool third. Particularly on normal and even heroic, depending on your raid's DPS, you may be able to skip some or all of one of the last pools that you do, and this means that you don't want to deal with the more difficult ones unless you have to. Now as you begin the fight, you'll want to pull the boss to the left side if you're starting with the fiery pool, and kind of in the center of that pool. He will jump into it very quickly, and that will be his first empowerment. So remember, the overall goal is that you're dealing with 3 basic mechanics during the fight, 1 of each of the colors, and one of those mechanics is going to be empowered based on whichever empowerment the boss last gained. So the idea is that you start with the fiery pool, so his first basic mechanic is going to be the explosive runes, which he's casting right there, and this was going to be empowered since he is empowered by the fiery at the time. So the basic explosive runes will spawn a ring of 5 runes around the center of the room. You can kind of see some of the runes in the top left. When these spawn, they will expand in size over a 15-second duration, and if they reach the full size after 15 seconds, they will explode and deal pretty heavy damage to the raid. However, you can prevent this raid explosion by having a player step on one of the runes. Stepping on the rune causes it to explode, hitting only that player and dealing moderate damage to that person only. Now, the normal version of these, the non-empowered version of runes, are simply dissipated the moment someone steps on one of them. So you just have a handful of players. It could be 5 if you want to do 1 each, or 2 or 3 people can do multiples. But you have a handful of people run out. Each of them touches a rune, runs over them. You can use a personal cooldown while you're doing it, and once the rune is stepped on, it will dissipate and it'll be gone. However, if you have the empowered version, which again you will get if he empowers from the fiery pool, like you're seeing here, these do not disappear when you first step on them. Instead, to deal with the empowered explosive runes, once a player steps on one of them, the rune will be pushed forward essentially and respawn itself. It will still deal the damage to the player, and it will reset its 15-second explosion timer. So if you watch on the top left there, you'll start to see some of our ranged players and healers moving out, and they will touch one of the runes, and this will explode it, and it will push the rune forward and basically cause it to respawn and start its timer over. The push forward distance is about 10 to 15 yards, and the direction that the rune is pushed is purely based on the facing direction of the triggering player. So it's not based on the angle that you come into the rune at or anything like that. It's based on the direction that you are facing when you step on it. So what this effectively means is you can control where the 5 runes, the empowered ones, are pushed. And this is critical because you want to ensure that you push them toward one another. To get the empowered runes to despawn, you have to push them on top of one another. So if 2 runes or more than 2 runes are on top of one another within about 5-6 yards of each other, only one of those runes will actually respawn. The other one will just be consumed essentially. So in an ideal world, you would push all 5 of them toward the center of that ring, that circle, and after doing that 2 or 3 times each, all the runes except for 1 would be sucked up into one another, because there's obviously not a rune for the last rune that's by itself to get pushed onto. However, the empowered runes will also despawn if there's only the last one rune available. So the game is smart enough for that. So if you watch the top left, you can see this in action. Our raid members are basically pushing them toward the center, kind of by the red marker there. Now we're down to 2. There's the last one, and then that one will explode on its own afterward, and that's it. So, empowered explosive runes, mechanically quite simple. The important thing is to make sure you assign players that know what's going on and can push them properly. So like I said, I think we have 2 or 3 ranged players and healers assigned to them. You want to use people that have a good personal cooldown ability, because the damage is reasonable, and if you're taking more than 2 at a time, you'll probably need a cooldown or a lot of heals. So assign a few people to do this, make sure they're pushing them by facing toward the center, and once a few runes have been pushed, then you can actually push the others toward one another rather than just a spot in the room. So the second pool we're doing is Shadow. And again, once you gain empowerment from the fire, you're free to move anywhere in the room you want. Just make sure the boss is nearest to the next pool that you want him to jump into when the time comes. So the main ability for the Shadow pool that you'll see throughout the fight is Fell Outpouring. This will cause a series of purple waves to spawn from the purple pool, as you can see in the back there. However, the empowered version, once it gains empowerment of the Fell Outpouring, causes waves to spawn from every pool at once. So you can see we have red and green and purple waves all going at the same time. Now, dealing with this is really just a matter of not being afraid to stop your primary duties. So like if you're DPS, stopping DPS temporarily to focus on your movement, positioning, and survival. Outside of that, it can also help for the raid in general to position somewhere that's a little safer. So you might try the sort of entrance corner of the room, which is kind of where we're toward there, because this will, generally speaking, allow you to avoid the majority of the waves that would potentially threaten the room, since the majority of the space in the room where the waves from fiery and from purple are going is not going to threaten you. But beyond that, the real key, like I said, is just thinking ahead, zooming your camera way out, and dodging more than focusing on, just doing damage or primary healing, that kind of stuff. Because there won't be any real damage to heal if people dodge properly. Now the final pool is Toxic, of course. And so the main ability for this green pool is Grasping Hands, which you'll see is casting here. The normal version of this will cause the boss to spawn a Grasping Hand holding every player in the raid, and they will basically just be stuck there until the hand that's holding them is killed. In addition to the actual hold itself, this will deal moderate damage to the player and anyone within a very small distance around them. So the general way to deal with this is to loosely stack the raid, kind of clumped up in melee. There are a few different ways you can go about it. You can see that unfortunately the footage I have here is not all that great, but you can see we're roughly stacked up, or like loosely stacked up behind the boss there in melee. We could be stacked closer, but it's completely fine here. But the goal is to make sure that everyone is not stacked right on top of one another, because the area of effect damage of the entire raid getting hit by Grasping Hands simultaneously will kill people. But you can stack in some pretty big groups. So if you want to split the raid into 2 or 3 assigned groups, you can have one right up under the boss in melee, the other 2 on either side, just slightly out of melee, that kind of thing. Anyway, have those groups stacked up tightly, but each group needs to be 5 or 6 yards away from the other group. And if you do that, then the groups won't share damage with one another from the area of effect, but they'll just hit other group members that are near them. But that's survivable. Anyway, the basic goal here is to get people close enough so you can area of effect the Grasping Hands down quickly and not be afraid to use personal cooldowns or raid cooldowns to deal with the damage that comes out from it. They have very low health, so it's easy to kill them off. Now, I apologize that I don't have any footage of the empowered Toxic pool which is the empowered grasping hands. And what these essentially do is once they grab you, they will pull every player toward the nearest of the 3 pools on the outside. So, again, I wish I had footage of this. I apologize, I don't, but I know how it works. The basic idea is you want to have a specific pool that you're slightly closer to than the other ones. So, the raid will generally be in the center of the room when this is about to happen, but then you're slightly closer to one of the pools, and that way everyone that's clumped up pretty close together in melee range will all be dragged toward the same pool. And you can pick any pool you want, particularly if you're doing this as the last, empowerment pool, then you can just go to whichever pool you want to be the next one on the list if you get to that point in the fight. But that's the basic idea. So choose one of the pools, be slightly closer to it than the others, but still quite far in the center of the room. Use your cooldowns, and then once the hands actually spawn, burn them down as quick as you can so that you kill them before anyone gets dragged into the pool, because standing in pools does a huge amount of damage. All right, so let's get into some tips for DPS first. The first thing to do is just focus on single target damage. There, like I said, are very few adds in this fight, only the grasping hands, and that's just a short burst of area effect cleave damage, which is easy for everyone to do. Generally, you want to try to stack up in 2 to 3 clumps in melee range before grasping hands actually applies, and try to stay spread about 5 yards apart from other groups, but you can stay within your clump very close together. You want to use high damage reduction cooldowns if you have them available and you're soaking the explosive runes. Usually this is going to be a ranged DPS that are assigned to this. So if you are a ranged DPS and you have higher damage reduction cooldowns, don't be afraid to volunteer for that. And remember that when you're dealing with the empowered explosive runes, you want to face the direction that you want the rune to be pushed toward to get them stacked on one another. Make sure when you dodge waves, it's more important to actually focus on dodging them than it is to DPS at that moment. If you survive the waves, fine, you can finish the fight out. And then finally, make sure you stay spread at least 4 yards from everyone else during the pound ability, which is used fairly commonly throughout the fight. Once it's over, though, you're free to move back into position anywhere you want. Next up, for the tank tips, there are 3 basic tank mechanics you have to deal with, one at any given time based on which pool the boss last empowered from. So, the first of these we'll talk about is Fiery Pool, which causes them to use Explosive Blast. This will target the current tank, and that tank will be rooted in place. They'll have a 10-second debuff, which you can see is happening to me right now. When it expires, the player will explode, hitting anyone within 40 yards. Now, when you have this, you can't do anything as a tank, unfortunately, so you just have to stay there. So generally the rule is to try to keep the boss near the edge of a pool or against a wall when this is about to be cast, and that way when it does apply, the off-tank taunts immediately, and the tank and the rest of the raid move at least 40 yards from the afflicted player. Explosion goes off, and then you just repeat the process. Pretty simple to deal with. Your healers may want to watch out that the afflicted tank is topped off before this explodes. The second ability is from the Shadow Pool, which is Swat. And I don't have great footage of this, but I have footage of it going off at least. You can see what it looks like, but this is not the way to handle it. So you may have noticed there, this is the only clip I have of this ability, unfortunately, but essentially what it will do is, again, it will target the current tank of the boss, and it will swat them or knock them far away in whatever direction they are from the boss. So here you can see I'm getting knocked far, far away. And that player will take damage when they land, inversely proportional to the distance they traveled. What this means is that you do want to make sure you travel quite far when the SWAT hits you. So try to be have your back toward a faraway wall. However, the key here, which I do not do in this clip, because I was moving the boss at the time, you want to try to have your back somewhere against a wall where there's not a pool under it. Because if you're in a pool, it's going to do really heavy damage to you while you're inside it, and that could be dangerous. So try to prepare for SWAT by putting your back toward a faraway wall that is not that doesn't have a pool under it. So you can use the entrance wall or any of the walls between the back pools if you need to. And then you'll just get knocked far away. As soon as the SWAT hits, the other tank should taunt immediately so the boss doesn't move. And that's it. The tank that got swatted will take a little bit of damage, but not much, and they'll just run back. The final tank ability from the toxic pool is Foul Crush. And again, I apologize I don't have any footage of this ability just because we didn't see that phase in our kill. But the idea here is that the current tank, again, will be afflicted with this ability. In this case, it grabs the tank in a very large hand, just like the grasping hands and all the raid members are dealing with. But this will deal increasing damage over time to the tank until the hand is broken, or killed rather, and breaks the tank out. So, just like the other abilities, as soon as this is applied to the current tank swap should happen immediately. And then, including heals on the tank that's being crushed, DPS need to just quickly break the tank out so they don't die, because the damage does ramp up over time. So that's the basic idea. The good news is you don't have to do anything positionally, but you just have to be aware that it's coming in and tank swap immediately when it hits. And then lastly, for healer tips, generally there are two major damage points in the fight to use personal or healing cooldowns, and that's Grasping Hands and Pound. Pound, it's important that the raid members are spread 4 yards apart. Otherwise, this will be extremely high damage on those that are stacked too close. So this is critical for melee in particular. Grasping Hands, of course, is a big burst of damage for people that are close to one another, as well as ticking damage. So don't be afraid to use raid cooldowns for that. Try to keep the tanks topped off just before the SWAT ability hits them, so that they don't get killed from the actual damage that they take from it. And I just didn't mention in the note there, but also make sure that they're topped off before the explosion from explosive blast. But otherwise, you have to run 40 yards away just like everyone else. If you can do so, don't be afraid to help out for the explosive runes as a healer. You can absolutely do it just like ranged DPS, particularly if you have a good personal damage reduction cooldown. And remember that the facing of your character dictates the push direction for the empowered runes. And then finally, spam heal the current tank when they get afflicted with Foul Crush if you reach the toxic empowered phase. So, I believe that covers everything for Heroic Kormrok. Like I said, overall mechanically, pretty simple fight. There's not a whole lot of stuff going on, but it's just important you kind of get used to the pattern and how the different abilities work when they're empowered versus not empowered. For the most part, if you can handle grasping hands properly and the the empowered runes properly, the rest of the fight should fall into place quite easily. As always, good luck. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. So if you want to help us out and subscribe, that'd be amazing. Kormrok and I have this great trip planned. We want to go cross country and visit all the pools that we find around this beautiful nation of ours, but man, we just need the subscriptions that'll pay for our trip somehow.